how can fish oil do all these things? Because if you give enough of it, it reduces inflammation. And that's why it's as close to a miracle drug as I'll see in my lifetime. Now, how much do you need? Well, we do thousands of blood tests, so I'll give you some broad aspects. Let's say you're well. You're not overweight. You don't have chronic disease. You probably need 2.5 grams of omega-3 fatty acids per day. Let's put this in perspective. When your grandparents gave your parents a tablespoon of cod liver oil, the world's most disgusting food known to mankind, they were giving them about 2.5 grams of omega-3 fatty acids. And in my opinion, the greatest public health care disaster in the 20th century was the day that parents stopped giving their children fish oil. But let's say you're under inflammatory attack. You're fat, you have heart disease, or you have diabetes. Plan to double the dosage. And what if you now no longer have silent inflammation, but you have screaming pain, cancer or chronic pain? Still higher. And what if the inflammation now is inside the brain? Still higher levels. These are very high levels of omega-3 fatty acids, but they're therapeutic levels. If you give a placebo dose, you get placebo effects. If you want to squeeze all you can out of life, make sure you're getting adequate levels of fish oil. Now, the wild card of how much omega-3 fatty acids you need determines how much toxic fat is being induced by your diet. The more you control toxic fat by the diet, and specifically the zone diet, the less omega-3 fats you need to dilute out any excess. On the other hand, the less you control toxic fat by the diet, eat whatever you want to, the more fish oil you need to dilute out the effects of this increasing levels of toxic fat. Because to control silent inflammation requires a multifactorial approach. What does that mean? You got to come from a lot of different angles. There's no magic bullet. The zone diet reduces toxic fat formation. That's how it works. The EPA in the fish oil dilutes out any remaining toxic fat. But the last thing in your diet is what is how to modulate your gene expression. And this is the real power of the zone diet. Not to decrease inflammation, but really to change the expression of your genes. Let's go back a little time in history to look at the pharmaceutical world. In the 1930s, we discovered what are called enzymes. These are proteins that do things, they're little factories in the body. And since that time, the entire pharmaceutical industry has been making small molecule drugs that could basically inhibit those factories. But those days are over. We've done probably the best we can. In 1985, we learned how to challenge or to convert bacteria into little factories that make complex proteins. That gave rise to genetic engineering. And we're seeing a lot of complex proteins being made, but they're starting to run out of steam. In the year 2000, we cracked the genetic code. And now this is ushering in a whole new era of medicine, gene therapy. We can change the genes. Very exciting stuff. So what's actually gene therapy? Well, you could inject stem cells and hope they become the right organ, but stem cells have a nasty habit of becoming cancer drugs, so that hasn't worked out too well. You could actually inject the gene and hope it finds the right spot. Hasn't worked too well. Or, new technology, you could silence genes. They're giving you all the problem, especially the genes that cause inflammation. And finally, you can now modulate, change how the genes are expressed. The last two things, gene silencing and modulation of gene expression, this is what the zone diet does. That's why it's exciting. It allows you, don't like the genes you're born with? That's okay. You can change them in the kitchen. You can't change them, but you can change their expression. And you can silence the genes that cause inflammation. That's the exciting thing about the zone diet. It allows you to revamp and take control of your genetic future. This is a powerful message. Your diet can turn on the genes that reduce silent inflammation And it can turn off genes that generate silent information. That elevates diet to a much higher aspect. So whatever you're thinking in life, if I want a longer life, better performance, it's all in my genes. But I have the power to change, to turn on and turn off genes if I treat food with the same respect that I treat a drug. And really, this is a convergence of diet and genes over the last 400 million years, that the food intake and our systems have been in intimate contact. And all these remain deeply embedded in our genes. They will not go away. What's happened in the last 30 years, our food intake has changed so dramatically, our genes have not been able to respond. And if we look at the immune system, which is an integral part of this overall systems, there's two parts. There's the really modern part, the antibodies and stuff like that. But the real primitive part of our immune system that we share with fruit flies is one that's controlled by the diet. And that's where basically the diet becomes so important. And we know from molecular biology that the primary players of this all recently discovered things like toll-like receptors, genetic transcription factors. These are the players. And this is how they work. Again, no test. This will say it's complex. So let's make it a little simpler. And I'll use the term epigenetics. Epigenetics is simply saying how our environment, and especially our diet, can affect the translation of our genes. And all these factors here, we can now affect by the diet. In particular, these toll-like receptors, if I have a diet rich in saturated fats, they'll be activated. And when they're activated, what happens? They cause inflammation. That's why you want to keep saturated fats low in your diet. But the omega-3 fatty acids can inhibit them to stop inflammation. These NF-kappa Bs, the inhibitors, are things like the omega-3 fatty acids and chemicals called polyphenols. We'll talk about these later, but what are polyphenols? These are the chemicals that give fruits and vegetables all their color. And in high enough concentrations, they too are anti-inflammatory agents. No color, no polyphenols. What things don't have color? White bread, white rice, pasta, and potatoes. I think you see the picture. Now these polyphenols, this is one of the studies we did, taking cells, and you can now cause them to become inflamed by injecting in the medium, give what is called tumor necrosis factor, a very powerful inflammatory hormone. And as you increase the amount of polyphenols, you shut that off completely at the genetic level. That's why your mother said apple a day keeps the doctor away. It's the polyphenols in the apple that help make your immune system work better. And it also, these polyphenols can affect an enzyme called AMP kinase. AMP kinase is the key enzyme in your body because it makes ATP. Now, why that's important will be in the next lecture on performance. But it's not only performance is important, it's your daily life. If you can't make enough ATP, the body slows down. And there's two ways you can basically make more ATP. One actually is calorie restriction. If you cut back your calories, you activate a gene called SIRT1 and increases AMP kinase, and the end result, you live longer. But these same polyphenols can activate the same gene. That's why you eat colorful fruits and vegetables as opposed to bread, pasta, white potatoes. And these are all the gene targets that AMP kinase, if activated, deal with. So if your goal is wellness, which should be the #1 goal, you have to follow an anti-inflammatory diet for a lifetime. Not for 2 weeks, not for 2 months, not for 2 years, for the rest of your life, if wellness is your goal. And it's pretty simple. You eat small meals throughout the day. You have some protein at every meal. You eat primarily vegetables, and you take your fish oil. It doesn't sound very high-tech, does it? Well, I've just tried to show you what's actually in your body is incredibly high-tech. And that's why I said earlier, sometimes we make medicine a lot more complex than it really is. In many ways, medicine we see today is like an iceberg. We see the tips of the iceberg, but below the surface lies most of the mass. We see today, we see the cancer, we see the autoimmune diseases, we see the heart disease, we see the neurological disease, we see the aging process. And they seem to be all separate. But in reality, they're all connected below the surface by silent inflammation. The more you reduce silent inflammation by the diet, the size of the peaks that you see gets smaller and smaller. It doesn't say that food will replace drugs, but food makes drugs work better at lower concentrations. Lower concentrations, lower side effects. So here's my view of 21st century medicine, and really 21st century anti-inflammatory medicine. The key for the future is reduction of silent inflammation. You can only do that by controlling your hormones and keeping them in a zone that's not too high, but not too low. Diet is your primary drug, and high-dose fish oil is a key component of that diet. And if you do that successfully, you return to the beginnings of modern medicine with Hippocrates, when he said some 2,500 years ago, let food be your medicine, let medicine be your food. We now know what the old guy was talking about. It's how food can affect our hormones, how those hormones can affect our genetic expression, and if we control our genes, we control our future. That's the exciting aspect. So with that, I've given you a little background on, again, the real key, the reason why you basically train. You want to maintain wellness. But here's the molecular reasons. Now we'll take a short 15-minute break here and then come back and talk about how this is all translate into improving athletic performance.